Melissa's talking first.
But I have a
Follow
meeting,
Melissa.
so I
She's
can't stay
first.
forever.
Well, we'll see.
You're
All right.
into our time.
Bye. Oh, are we started?
All right, it is. Are we good on? All right. All right. So it's 4:30. We'll go ahead and get started. This is a public workshop to discuss proposed change that will affect wetland density. Is that on? Is that better? Appreciate y'all coming out. All those on Zoom, welcome. We'll go through just a little bit. We'll introduce ourselves. We'll go through a little bit of history on what the language is and what the proposed language is. If any those of you who are here, there's restrooms down that hallway. Hopefully this won't get too long, but if you need to take a break, you can. And then we'll give an opportunity for everybody who wants to speak, including those who are joining us virtually. So we'll just ask that everybody be mindful of everyone else. We'll try to keep the comments directed towards us and what this particular language is. If we want to have discussions about other things, we can do that at another time. But try to stay on point and just be respectful of everybody's opinion and their time, and we'll move through this as quick as we can. But we want to make sure we give everybody an opportunity. That's why we're here today. So with that, I am Jason. My name is Jason Catalano. I'm the floodplain manager here in Walton County. So we ensure that we're in compliance with my job. Ensure we're in compliance with the NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program, FEMA regulations, and our local floodplain ordinances. This is Haley. She is our environmental planner.
I'm basically just going to be the one that.
And we've got Aaron Breaker. He's our, what's your title? Aaron wears a lot of hats. He's been in a lot of positions. He's been here a long time. So I know Kristen said we're the babies, but we've all been here. We've all been involved in this for quite a while. So Aaron's going to run. He's just probably well, I won't speak for Haley, but Aaron's smarter than I am. So he's running the Zoom stuff and keeping us on track with that. But with that, we'll hand it off to Haley. She's going to go through the presentation, and then we'll go from there.
So we just wanted to outline what the differences are with the new code or the proposed code and the current code. And so we'll go through this relatively quickly, and then we want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to speak. We did give ourselves an hour, but want to make sure everybody is aware that we will stay longer if we need to. So with that, let's keep going. All right, so the proposed wetland density transfer is essentially going to remove the language that allows you to build the underlying density onto the upland property. So it's going to change the land development code and the comprehensive code. And it's only being applied to South Walton. Currently, there are 3 scenarios for developing within the county. With this new code change, it would remove scenario 1 for all properties within South Walton. Basically, instead of getting to develop your entire piece of property, if there are wetlands on the property, you would only be able to develop the upland, and you would only receive the density for the upland portion. This would be, well, go back for a second. Loss of records, they would still remain the same. And if you were to impact wetlands, the penalty would still be the same. You would only get 1 per 20. can still impact wetlands by getting a DEP permit, but you would have to still abide by the 1 per 20. Well, it wouldn't be transferring, it would just be developing.
What he's saying
Sorry.
is specifically, if you don't mind. Right, what he's talking about is the one is an incentive, the other is a penalty.
Okay.
And so right now, you get an incentive to develop all your
Correct.
if there is no incentive,
Yeah.
Okay.
but please go on.
Yeah, we're going to go into that a little bit further with the next slide.
Yeah.
And I'll take questions at the end. I didn't realize it was going to get that involved. So let's move forward a little bit into our lovely graphics here. So this is an example. What we have here is a 10-acre piece of property. Now, this is a very basic, like elementary graphic for purposes of explaining this. So we've taken a couple of different things into account: the acreage, the amount of wetlands on the property, and the zoning. So for our example here, if you have a 10-acre piece of property and half of it's wetlands and half of it is uplands, and you wanted to utilize the density transfer, you could build out the entire piece of the density for the entire piece of property on the upland portion of the property. So for this example, you would get 40 units if you did not impact the wetlands. Now, if you were going to impact the wetlands, so you had more land, more space to put your homes, you would then be penalized and then reduce your unit per acre because of the wetland impact. So right now, there's not an incentive to impact the wetlands. There's a penalty, so as you were saying. So this is how it currently is. And the proposed removal of the density transfer, you would not get to utilize the density for the wetland portion of the property. So instead of 40 units for the entire 10 acres, you would only get 20 units. So that is the proposal to reduce the amount of density within the upland areas.
I think a little bit your question about the 1 to 20 density. So as Haley was saying, you would still be able to go to the wetland impact permit. And if you impacted those wetlands, those are now no longer wetlands. They would become uplands at that point. And so the penalty of the 1 to 20 would apply to that portion. That would still be an applicable language. So it wouldn't necessarily give them full credit because now it's uplands. They would still have that penalty. So that's why that language or that scenario is still in there. You're allowed to impact wetlands if you get the appropriate permits. No, yeah.
So at the time that you get a
right.
once they create that filter, it develop it. Whatever this lot, if this use this scenario, 10 acres, 5 acres, value of that is if you have to pay $150,000 still make that back by creating large lots.
quick because none of what y'all are saying is being recorded, and they're all really great points, and we want to make sure that that's recorded. So I only have a couple more slides. So let's get through that, and then we'll go back to this conversation because it is very important that the points that you're making are recorded. So thank you, guys. Okay, so we wanted to just show you guys what some plans are that have utilized the current density transfer to create these conservation areas to preserve the wetlands. This is one example. As you can see, the buffer, the 25-foot buffer, and the wetlands are outside of the property line. Today we require all buffer and wetlands to be in public areas, common areas. And so that would further reduce the potential impact from homeowners having the wetlands on their land. They may or may not know about it. So this keeps everything on the development side. So previously, before we made the change to put these wetlands and buffers in common areas, this is an example of lots that had wetlands and buffers on the properties. So some of these properties, as you can see, the stripes, the gray and white stripes, those are wetlands, and it can seriously impact the potential property owner. They're then required to preserve that, whether they know it or not when they purchase the property, and then it limits the developable area for the property owner. County, we are required to have statutes that protect our wetlands. They are important. They provide many beneficial attributes to Walton County. It's what makes Walton County beautiful. So not only is it helpful for the environment, but it also helps the homeowner in preventing or helping to prevent flooding. It allows all the water to flow away from the homes. It creates this lower depression area, and it filters all the water that comes through so that when it goes to the bay or the Gulf, it's been cleaned through the vegetation that lives there. So that being said, we have a couple of steps that we're going to go through once this is complete. I just want everybody to be on the same page. We're going to report all of the comments that you all make to the planning commission, and from there it'll go to the board. But that will allow you guys to continue your conversation. If somebody would like to come up to the podium, just say your name and we'll start taking some notes on the app.
So our goal here tonight is to listen to those comments and take notes. We'll put some notes up on the screen so you guys can see. And then we'll relay that back. So we would ask that whoever has something to say or has questions, if you would come up to the podium, and then we'll kind of go through there. So we'll give everybody an opportunity. And this crowd here, and I know we've got quite a few on Zoom. We'll kind of go back and forth between people in the room and those who are joining us virtually. So,
well, in addition, we'd like to make sure that if there's a comment that's being repeated, we want to continue the flow of the meeting, and if you'd like to just state that you have the same comment, we will make a note of that so that it's recorded. There's multiple concerns for that same comment, but we'd like to keep the flow going so that everybody has an opportunity. Okay.
All right, so I see a hand. So if you want to come up, if you can give us your name, and then we'll ask your questions or comments, and we'll just go from there.
Yeah,
we'll do the best we can, but
my name is Fred Tricker, Tricker, and I just wanted to follow up on the discussion that we already started that we weren't supposed to be having, but we did anyway. Well, let me just say, first of all, I think the language that's currently in there is very convoluted. It's hard to follow. And I would recommend that you take a serious look at doing a rewrite of it to make it more clear as to what you're actually saying. It's really hard to follow. Okay, so on the 1 in 20 thing, the argument is that if you impact the wetlands, you get a density credit for that, which I don't understand why you would get any credit for impacting the wetlands. To me, there's serious restrictions on when you can impact wetlands for very, very minimal impacts, and there's a mitigation requirement, which, as Melissa said, is very, very expensive. So there's a big penalty, and it's hard to do, and we're going to discourage the heck out of people doing that. It doesn't make any sense to me to give them any density bonus on the developable land as a result of that. So that means, does that make any sense? Is that?
Yeah. So essentially would be proposing to remove that
just take it out of there. And just a question, do you all know why, and I think the BCC mandated that we're only looking at South Walton, that this doesn't impact North Walton. Would it, I mean, is that, you know what the basis for that was? Have any understanding on that?
I just know they asked us to look at it.
Yeah.
I wasn't in that meeting.
I was at the meeting. I don't recall any discussion on it. There was just kind of a given that that's where all the issues are, maybe. I don't know. So let me ask you this question then. Is it worth considering maybe a recommendation at some point that they look at doing the same rules for North Walton?
Yeah, we'll write it down
It's a question more than anything else, but maybe staff has a recommendation that they might want to put forward on that.
Okay.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Anybody else here?
My name is Jacqueline Alwyn, ALWIN, and I'm just curious what has prompted this at this time.
As far as I know, everybody's wondering. It came from the commission. They asked staff to take a look at this, to draft some language about this idea of eliminating the density transfer option.
This isn't an effort to preserve wetlands. What is it an effort to?
That I don't know if we can answer that tonight. I think that as far as what this workshop is just regarding the actual proposed language itself. Maybe what some of the unintended consequences may be. What are the pros? What are the cons? Here's what we think this could be, and to just kind of give that conversation. The why, I don't know if we could answer.
Well, I think that's very important to know why and why now, and is it having anything to do with trying to slow down growth in South Walton? I mean, what is the purpose of it?
Yeah, we can ask that and see if we can get a clearer answer of the genesis of it at this moment.
I mean, the way I look at it, some of us who own property north of 98, who have been sitting on this property for some time waiting for it to be in demand, all of a sudden now that it looks like we're finally there, you're getting ready to rip it right out of our hands. And I don't think that's right. And if it's because they've overdeveloped on the 30A corridor, that shouldn't come to the detriment of us who own property north of 98. It's a whole different area. And the other point that I really see is that not everybody can afford to live on 30A. And the only affordable housing right now in South Walton would be north of 98. You have a lot of people who work on 30A who come from areas like north of 98, Freeport, Niceville. They all come in. I see this every day because I live on the Walton County line in Okaloosa. All the traffic going in to service all these businesses along the 30A corridor. And it is a lot of traffic on 98. And if you make it so that we can't have more affordable housing north of 98, you're going to make it impossible for people to work where the work is needed and support those businesses. And I just think that's wrong as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, as far as the reasoning, I think that's probably a question maybe all right, thank you. But we'll definitely we'll definitely ask the question and see if we can get a context of why, where this came from, why now, and that kind of stuff. But I don't know if we can answer that. I don't think anybody here can answer that on behalf of the board.
If I'd like to take my turn and then we can get back to that, if that's okay. Really, I know, Fred, you're dying to answer, and you can.
And then also, if we just
direct it at you,
to
yep.
us, so we don't get into the back and forth, we'd appreciate that.
Sure.
And then after Melissa goes, we'll have someone from.
So Melissa Ward with Dunlap and Shipman. In particular, and I do have a little packet in case y'all want to look at it later, so whatever. Some things that I wanted you all to consider while you're making your report back to the Planning Commission. The language that's here, while it is written specifically to the impacts on wetlands, it is more about density than it is wetlands. So to be clear, there's a misleading narrative going around that Walton County has, and I use quotes because this is what it came out as, 4 years, been illegally letting developers develop at higher densities. The fact is, and there are excerpts from previous documentation, historical documents for Walton County, that show that's not true. In fact, in 1985, the county calculated density on net density on net acreage, not gross. That is to say that the ordinance specifically said if you had 10 acres and 5 acres was wetlands, you calculated it based on the 5 acres that was uplands, excluding your buffers, excluding your setbacks, excluding any open space required. And then you could count your density. But they also let you get a DEP permit, develop uplands, and so you could fill the wetlands, count those uplands, and then exclude whatever was left. So they found out that that wasn't working. South Walton, in its community, and in 1991, the regulatory changes changed, and they developed a net density calculation. And if you got a DEP permit, you could fill it and calculate your density, but it was still net. That means to say, take out your wetlands, your open space, and your buffers, and then you could calculate your density. Two things this ordinance had that were interesting, and it's in the pages, is the 1985 ordinance had minimum lot sizes. Also, 1991 and 1985, those densities in South Walton were 35 units to the acre. So let's recalculate using your 10-acre example. 350 units, 5 acres, cut that in half, and that's what you would be able to build on that upland area. So obviously Walton County came back, the citizens of South Walton, plus the administrator and the county commissioners came back, and they developed a trust plan in 1994. They went through an entire series of research and analysis. And if those of you who are in the planning field are aware, the guy that worked on Seaside, Andrew Duaney, he was on that board. He understood completely what he was doing. This is not just a group of people trying to figure out some way to stop development. He was looking for good development. So inside your packet is a copy of the 1994, not a copy of the whole thing. It's a copy of one page of the 1994 language. And it specifically speaks to protecting natural resources by clustering. The densities went from being 35 units and 22 units per acre down to a maximum of 12 units per acre in VMU. And most of it was 8 units per acre if you could meet that qualification. For infill, the rest of them were 6 and 4 and 2. So and just for clarity, Walton County, highest density is still a low density anywhere else in the state and the nation. Walton County has South Walton all by itself, roughly, 57,000 acres, 16,000 acres of conservation land plus 1/3 conservation land cannot be developed just below the bay and the Intercoastal Waterway. So in 2018, they cleaned up the language in the comp plan from what it was before by saying, here are your situations when you have wetlands. If you have a wetland and you want to develop it and the density is 4 units per acre and you impact those wetlands, you are going to be punished for that. But if you avoid wetlands and have no impact, you can transfer all that density to your upland. That's your incentive. So, based on court cases and the statutes, they had developed a balancing act. Punishment if you impact the wetlands, incentive to stay out of the wetlands. What this language proposes is going back to 1985. It is anticipating, if you're not already, you should be, potential lawsuits. Because downzoning wetlands alone to 1 per 20, that's all it is. Not incentives and decentives and all of those things, it's just a downzoning. From properties that have 2 units per acre all the way up to 10 and 12 units per acre. And I feel like what they want to do is find a better way to develop those uplands without impacting those wetlands. At least that's the idea and what it should be. I've included in this packet the American Planning Association's policy on wetlands, one of which, and it's highlighted, is to encourage and allow states, in this case the county, to develop innovative ways and incentives to accomplish preservation of wetlands to the maximum extent possible, such as cluster zoning and transfer of development rights. This is not a principle that the county developed and said, hey, if you guys will just keep it out, it's fine, and we're not paying attention to what that's doing to the area. This is a principle that has been in place since 1928. It's something that people who have been developing in areas and do this as a lifelong, not just a passion or a study, but people who are concerned about wetlands encourage developers to do. In the strategic plan for Walton County in 1994, the strategic plan workshop, they specifically mention encouraging the economy of South Walton by clustering their development into hamlets and nodes and leaving the open space for ecotourism. And 25 years later, that's what you have. You have an economy built on ecotourism and a beautiful area, and you have hamlets and nodes that still allow the density that is underlying underneath. This language doesn't need to be changed. It is clear. If it needs to be cleared, let's look at it from a perspective of still allowing transfer of development rights. Otherwise, you will be looking at some potential problems. And I would just like to say again, and I just want to tie this all together, is that, again, the punitive hand in hand with the incentive is the legal way to go. It is the way that across the nation they handle these types of impacts, and it's what Walton County finally came to when they got their most recent 2018 adjustment. If you're going to look at ways to reduce the density that's transferred, but you can't reduce the density rights, right? Because that's what they're really doing. They're trying to reduce density. No more houses. That's what they're trying to do. So what we need to do is look at it. Instead of saying you can't have the density that you have a legal right to, let's look at potentially going back and looking at and then analyzing whether or not these 1985 and 1991 minimum lot sizes are applicable. Should we be having something like that? At least you're not taking my rights away. Then, if I can fit it on there, I should be allowed to develop it. Otherwise, you are seriously looking at some serious issues and taking us back in time to where wetlands will be impacted by fill. It's going to happen because as a developer, any person who's going to invest in that property has a vested interest in the outcome. And if they can spend $300,000 to mitigate 2 to 3 acres, make it back up on larger lots, they're going to do it. And then we're ruining our water quality, our stormwater management, and our wetland preservation conservation. So my boss asked me to say this out loud in the meeting because it has to do with Bert Harris. If I can find the right language he gave me. I know that he highlighted that one. He wanted me to say specifically, well, maybe I put it on that one. It's not about whether or not you have no rights to develop. It's about the reduction of development rights. Under Bert Harris, if I have the right to develop, we'll use that example, 40 units, and you take away my right by downzoning just wetlands to 1 per 20 just in South Walton, arbitrary and capricious, then I'm going to get an estimate on what the real market value is on 20 units, and you're going to pay that to me before I finish development. That's how that's going to fall out. And there will be, you know, lawsuits and so forth. So I have Bert Harris language. That's what I really wanted to say. And I'm happy to work with anybody on the language to figure out if there's a way, if it's not clear. I think it's clear. I've been doing this for 20 years. If it's not clear, let's work on a way to make it clear, but don't take away the transfer of development rights. Thank you.
Do we have... Okay. Is that on? Right. Hey, Jim, can you hear us?
Unmute.
Is this Jim?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. It's Barbara Morano. And what I'd like to say is I've listened to, I believe it's Melissa Ward, and I've listened to your presentation. It is still very confusing. I agree with Mr. Fred Tricker about the wording and the language. I would like to see none of the wetlands impacted. And I believe the density transfer as it is right now is hurting the community. I don't believe we're talking about affordable housing, really. We're talking about wetlands in respect to the lady who had come up. Some of you are familiar with the Horton project on Draper Lake. That started as a huge density transfer, and the wetlands supposedly were not being impacted, but the number of units was astronomical. So from that standpoint, I feel we have to make some changes. And I think maybe we need to do a small committee to think about that. I'd like to see South Walton Community Council represented by Fred Tricker. I think Melissa Ward would be excellent to sit down because this is going to be hacked out in public and it's still very confusing. And I think just having this small meeting today and maybe 2 people on Zoom is not enough to get public input. I think if you had a small community group of very talented and interested citizens and then take some more input from them, I think it would be very beneficial.
Okay.
At the end.
Can I ask you one question just to make sure I understood your comment?
Sure.
You mentioned the language is confusing. Are you referring to the current language that's in the code or the proposed language or both?
The proposed language is very confusing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. And you said we had one other person? Julia, can you hear me? Julia? Are you there?
Me?
Yeah, is this Julia? Can you hear me? Hello?
Me?
Hey, Julia, is that you?
Hello.
Yes, I can hear you.
I can hear you.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Is this Julia? I feel like we're missing each other. We'll give it one more shot. Can you hear me, Julia?
Maybe when we're talking at the same time, it mutes the other person.
Okay, well, if we can hear you, so go ahead and make your comments, and we'll go from there.
So I'm Julia Dahm. I'm a local resident. I live in Inlet Beach. Wanted to start getting a little bit more involved. Let me say to start with that I know that we are a fast-growing community and that growth is necessary. On the other hand, I think that we need to make sure we ensure that our growth is responsible. So I'm very concerned about the language that appears to have come in place in '07 that allows for the density transfer from wetlands. There's some inconsistencies in the current language. And so wanted to kind of try and make sure that I fully understand that, and if I do, kind of point out some inconsistencies. So essentially, the comprehensive plan states in 1.1.4, it references the primary wetland protection zone as established by the Land Development Code. So if you go over to the Land Development Code, 4.01.2 of the Land Development Code establishes that the primary wetland zone is the and the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. It further defines the secondary wetland zone as the buffer surrounding it, which in this case is currently at 25 feet. That's a whole separate issue because the state of Florida defines the upland buffer as 50 feet, but we can address that part later. So then you go to the Land Development Code, section 4.01.03, restrictions on development. And it says, within the primary wetland protection zone, dredge and fill activities shall be prohibited except when demonstrated to be in the necessary public interest. So it further states that these impacts can only be made when unavoidable. So now we've established that wetlands are not usable in their natural state and that they are conservation lands. So then if you go back to the comprehensive plan in 1.8.1, it states that on the future land use, it should have no residential density and allow no non-residential uses except for conservation uses necessary to provide public access and manage conservation. And then goes on to say there's no impervious surface ratios for this designation. You go to the, if you do impact wetlands, you have the 1 unit per 20 acres penalty. So basically what I'm seeing is that we have established that wetlands have no value in their natural state. And furthermore, if you impact them, their value is 1 per 20. So then by definition, it seems as though wetlands should have a max value of 1 per 20, but based on the 1.1.5, but truly they should have no underlying value at all, as conservation lands don't have any density to them as outlined in 1.8.1. So therefore, what I'm seeing I'm bearings on all this, but the ordinance in '07 provided a false value to the wetlands that really kind of needs to be corrected because there's all those other inconsistencies. Essentially, if there's no value to be transferred from the wetlands to the uplands, then the wetlands are unusable in their natural state per section 401.03. So issues with upland density transfers, so long as it doesn't increase the density to such an extent that it conflicts with the existing land use. the way it presently reads, it appears that there's no restrictions on how much density might be able to be transferred from the upland. So feasibly, somebody could buy, say, a 100-acre parcel of land, of which only 20 acres is uplands, and transfer all of the density from result would be that you then have changed the property, how the property was intended to be. Because at that point, the property was intended to be a low-density, single-family residential, but the transfer density would allow for an apartment complex. It doesn't seem that that would be the logical intent of the language initially. So I think the problem is, like, the transference of that false wetland density could easily create a snowball effect where any adjacent property then has the justification for changing the density on their property, and then that goes on down the road, and the next property and the next property, they're like, well, the property next to me has a higher density, so you should change mine. This could easily snowball, and if that snowballs, then you're then rendering the comprehensive plan moot. Because one of the purposes of the comprehensive plan is so that you have compatibility of land uses. So if you allow this false wetland density transfer to the upland, then it could easily change the net function of the property. Is that it is what's done in most Florida counties, which is you define wetlands as conservation and therefore they're not developable. Density is based on the net usable land, which is the gross areas minus the wetlands. And if there's any question, it seems like it might be beneficial to be able to create a matrix of what other Florida counties are doing so that the county commission and the planning commission can see. We don't really need to recreate the wheel here. It's being done all over the state, and it's pretty established.
Okay, thank you. Is that the end of your comments, Julia?
I'd pause there and let you guys
okay.
take over, and I'll mute myself. How's that?
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to make a one point of clarity. So in regards to the comments regarding the conservation, the section that the policy that you cited in the comp plan, that's in regards to the conservation zoning district. So that would be different than say a zoning piece of property that was neighborhood infill that has wetlands within that development parcel. The wetlands portion currently doesn't have a different zoning category of conservation. So when we're talking about the wetland transfer, the density transfer, the underlying density of that zoning category, the example that we used at the beginning of the meeting, I think, was low density residential, which carries four units per acre. So even if you had wetlands within that, the underlying density is still there, and the current language allows you to cluster that or move it out to the upland portion. If you have a piece of property that is actually zoned conservation, then that language there would apply, and I think it carries no density, other than if it's a lot of record, you would be able to build one single-family home. So I just wanted to clarify the difference there between wetland lands that should be conserved versus the actual zoning category of conservation. I hope that makes sense.
The definition of wetlands, they're supposed to be conserved, correct?
Yeah, but the property zoning isn't conservation. So conservation is an actual zoning category that we have within our code, and we have property that is designated as that. But a wetland in and of itself doesn't mean it has a zoning category designation of conservation.
The zoning category of conservation, it is valid there as it is in its natural state. So why would it have value as a density?
So the future land use map establishes the future land use categories of the whole county, and then within that, our zoning map establishes the zoning of the particular parcel. So whatever the current zoning designation is the zoning for the entire parcel, whether or not there's wetlands on it or not. One of those categories that we designate is called conservation. It's its own category. So I don't want to confuse the word conserve with the zoning category of conservation. They're two very different things. So in regards to, if you had actual conservation land that was designated as conservation, it would have zero density. So this wouldn't apply. But again, if you have property that has a different zoning category, currently the underlying density of that category applies to the entire parcel acreage. And then you could move that density out of the wetland portions and maintain that overall density. What this proposed language would do is you would only get the density based off of the upland portion. So.
I fully agree with the proposal to not allow for density transfer. I would also encourage that using other Florida counties as a example would be an easy justification, because the vast majority of Florida counties do not allow for full transfer of wetland densities to uplands. Okay,
thank you. All right, we'll come back to the room. Is there, okay? All right. Just give us your name and.
Randy Butler, 1216 J.D. Miller Road, South Walton. And I appreciate the time. I would like to concur with pretty much what Melissa's saying about the Byrd-Harris Act. I mean, that, honestly, I grew up in Franklin County. I was part of, or not part of, but I was witness to the St. Joe Company filing a lawsuit against Franklin County for $6.5 million under the Byrd-Harris claim. And it was a taking of their land use, or the density in their land use. So I do think that will be something the county will deal with the new proposed policy. And honestly, I think that your land regs or your policies are doing what they're supposed to do. And I say that not just off the hip. I mean, I worked 7 years prior to where I'm at now. I was a land acquisitioner for D.R. Horton Homes, and the majority of the properties we bought in South Walton were properties we were targeting toward really the teachers, the firemen, people that work in businesses in South Walton hospitality. It's because that is really the only properties you can get the density. What's left of the wetlands is to maybe do townhomes. And we did a lot of townhome projects. And these townhome projects, and there's some D.R. Horton people in this room, and it is targeted for really the worker. I mean, this is the essential workers. You don't want everybody that works in South Walton driving across the bridge from either East Okaloosa or West Bay County. I mean, you really want to try to put people where they work, where they serve. I know if I've got a fire, I want a fireman that is close by, honestly. So I just think it's obviously a Byrd-Harris claim, and I do concur with what Melissa said, and that can go on the record. I do believe if conservation or preservation is something that is the intent, I'm not saying it is, I would say that according to my estimates, Melissa has 15,000 acres of conservation land in South Walton. From what I've looked at, it's roughly 26,000 acres. It's either conservation, preservation, or state forest lands. So of that will always be in conservation. So you're dealing with a very limited amount of property left. So I don't really see what this mad rush into making this policy change is going to really, I think you're a day late and a dollar short on it, honestly. I think it's a bad policy, and I think it opens the county up for a lot of litigation. And that's all I got to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Nurse.
Marzullo. It's Marzелlo, and I do run the D.R. Horton Home Building Division. I got a couple questions. My first question is, what are you going to do about the existing communities that have an empty lot in them? The guy didn't build a house. All of his neighbors built a house. He didn't build a house. You change this, he can no longer build his house?
No, I believe. Do you want to answer that, or? Oh, I believe that this would only apply to new development projects. So if you had an existing, either existing lot of record or a platted lot, that project has already been approved for that density. So this language wouldn't apply to an existing.
But so does the vacant piece of land that I own. It has the same, but you're going to change that one. How could you not change existing communities? That confuses me.
So do you have a current development order approval for your
That's
vacant
what I'm saying.
piece?
You're saying a DO would be the active.
Yes.
Because that was my question. The question too is, how are you going to separate this? Is DO going to be the? So again, you've got homeowners in South Walton who have owned this land for 50 years. They didn't sell. They didn't develop. They held. Now you're going to come to them and say, hey, I appreciate you not developing it, appreciate you doing this, but I'm going to take half of your value away because I'm going to cut your density down to half. I mean, those people are going to go, they're going to sue because obviously the value of their land is reduced almost in half depending on the size of the lots and everything. So obviously I do concur with both Randy and Melissa on their points, but I think you guys are opening yourselves up to a huge problem. The other thing is, how can you tell me that if I own 5 acres north of the bridge and I own 5 acres south of the bridge and I pay my taxes to Walton County like everyone else does, that I got different rules? That just because you cross the bridge, you got a whole different set of rules here than what I have in the rest of this county. And I voted for the same commissioners everybody else did. I think that's problematic to begin with, that you're going to isolate and separate South Walton by itself. We asked, oh, I'm sorry. Okay, they asked earlier, which is really what a lot of our concern is how did this happen? Like, how did we get here? Because we are already restrictive as it can be. And now you're telling me that you're going to take away density to the owners that own the land. You're going to restrict on how many homes they can build on their property if they're able to get it sold. And either the value of that land is going to go down, and those price houses, obviously, if you can only build 50 homes in all of South Walton versus 100, those 50 homes are going to be expensive. So it just reeks to me like this is 38 rich people trying to get the workers in South Walton out of their way and away from them. Because what you're doing is you're going to price the homes so high because there's only going to be so many left. And to Randy's point, really, how many acres are left to be developed in South Walton? Really? If you take away everything, what are we talking about here? A couple thousand at the most. So everyone else prospered, and everyone that's on this Zoom call and in this room in here, the neighborhoods they lived in, they wouldn't be living here if this rule applied. Most of these people in here would not be living in the houses they're living at today because there wouldn't be the houses because your density wouldn't be there. So you're talking about most of the people in Walton wouldn't be here, won't be here in the future, and wouldn't have been here in the past. So now they want to come back and they want to change the rules after they're living in their house. They've gotten their density done. They got their neighborhood built. They're enjoying their short-term rental income, but nobody else can. And that CVS manager that can't afford to live on 30A, it ain't living in Walton either. They're going to live in Freeport and drive down. They're going to live in Fort Walton, and it's more reasonable, or in Panama City proper in order to come across the bridge to work here. Because again, the few, the rich, stop the rest of the people from being able to get houses. Just my humble opinion. But anyways, I think you're going to have lawsuits from the owner. You're going to have lawsuits from the developer. It's going to look like you guys are definitely favoritism to the South Walton 30A crowd is where it seems like the planning department is leaning heavily towards. Not to fairness to everybody, but just to a select few. And I think that's going to be huge problematic for your board. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Yeah. Derek, okay, so we'll go back to Zoom after.
Hi, I'm Donna Johns, JOHNS. I just want to say that I agree with Fred Tricker. I do believe that the language needs to be changed. I do live in South Walton, and South Walton is only so big, and our wetlands are important. We have to have the wetlands because we have a lot of stormwater issues, and they are very helpful. They're there for a reason, and we need to leave them there, and we need to protect them. And we don't need to cluster homes and put 20 homes on 5 acres and say, okay, well, we're really saying we've got all of this acreage, when we really don't. You've really got what you've got. You've got uplands, and that's what you've got. And build what the number you can on that. I don't understand why we ever included the wetlands, which people know when they have them that those are wetlands. Those are not to be built on. And as a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, recently there's been a grant in Florida or maybe even in Walton County to protect the wetlands. There's been some literature out about that. We've got to protect our wetlands. And the other thing is, if you start putting we do not need to make South Walton a parking lot. And just because all these developers want to build all these homes, that doesn't make it right. And they threaten, it's what I'm hearing is that they're threatening lawsuits right and left. Well, what about those of us that live there and you want to put another however many homes as you can squeeze on a little spot? We already have traffic, which is hideous, outrageous. And when the storms come, when the hurricanes come, and the fires like we had last year, when they happen, and we can't get out of our neighborhoods because they've wanted to put 20, 30, 40, 50 homes on a little area, we're really going to be in a bind. And there's where you're going to have some lawsuits right there. So I just ask that you do change the language and that you realize South Walton is just a small area and there is no reason to turn it into a parking lot. Thank you.
All right, we can go back. We'll go back to Scott. Can you hear us? There we go.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Welcome. All right, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to participate. A couple of things, just going back on a few of the things that were discussed here. You're talking about residential densities in relationship to conservation areas. We're talking about residential transfer of development rights. I'd like for the staff, as this goes forward, to address what happens when you get to non-residential lands. You've got plenty of lands that are designated commercial or industrial, or are there other land uses? What density transfers are allowed now or are proposed when you come to those categories? So I think it'd be helpful for the staff to respond to that as this goes forward, because whatever it is needs to be consistent based on all land uses.
Okay.
The other thing is...
Hey, Scott, I can give you a little bit of an answer to that if you want me to.
Go ahead.
All right, so when you're dealing with non-residential, it's not a question of density. It turns to what's called intensity. And so it goes to what's impervious surface ratio. So the area of the overall site, how much of that can be impervious. And then it also, does the FAR get affected by that? Okay. So if you have a current piece of property that allows non-residential activity and a portion of that property is wetland, if you impact that wetland area, then your allowable ISR, impervious surface ratio, drops to 10%. So typically, when you're looking at a non-residential allowance, it can be anywhere as high as, I think our highest is 85. So 85% of the overall site can be impervious. If you impact a wetland, that 85% would drop to 10% for that area. So that just to give you the context of what the current language, what the proposed language would only affect the residential change, the residential density. Currently, we're not looking at a change to the intensity portion, the non-residential. But if it's something that you want, we'll make note of it if you want us to bring that recommendation back.
No, I'm not suggesting that you should be transferring density off of wetlands. I think that the proposed change is a good idea. But the idea that you have wetlands that are contained within a commercial property if you're transferring density on a residential basis, then why wouldn't I be able to transfer the floor area from the preserved wetlands onto the upland area?
Yeah, so you can. Currently, you would. So let's just say, just because I'm not that great at math, we'll say you have 10,000 square feet, and you have an.
I understand.
Okay.
I understand. If I can transfer it, then the issue is not only with residential, it becomes an equal discussion with regard to intensities of development on commercial and industrial areas. The impervious surface ratio is a completely separate calculation from the FAR analysis. So I think you need to be able to address both of those.
Okay.
But what you're saying is that if I do preserve conservation areas, wetlands within a commercial property, then I do get to transfer the FAR as long as I don't exceed the ISR ratio.
Okay, so you're suggesting that we apply the same standard that we're talking with residential density to the non-residential intensity allowances.
Yes, I believe in the net developable land area as the basis for calculating densities and intensities of development. But the main question that I would like for the staff to address as they're going forward for the Planning Commission, the County Commission, is that under the comprehensive planning law, the primary function has been to balance not only the compatibility of land use, but it's primarily driven by the ability to predict and analyze the need for infrastructure to support that development. So if you started out at one point in time under the Walton County Comprehensive Plan, and it did not consider impacts on wetlands or transfer development rights, and then you came in and made a sweeping change that allowed for that transfer of density onto the uplands, then my question is, and I'd like for the staff to address to the Planning Commission, the County Commission, what was the basis for the calculation of development intensity throughout the county in calculating the amount of infrastructure necessary to support that development? You started out with the original comp plan saying that you weren't allowed to transfer densities off of wetlands, then that gives you one set of calculations for developing an analysis for infrastructure needs. So the question is that when you went through and changed the policy, was there a sweeping and comprehensive analysis of all of the infrastructure requirements that would be necessary to accommodate development that was transferred from all of the wetlands that weren't considered before to now being able to develop on the upland?
Okay.
Otherwise, if you have not calculated and completely reanalyzed all the infrastructure demand, then it's really a fundamental failure of the comprehensive planning effort to predict the amount of infrastructure that you need. And as a result, you would be grossly underestimating sewer, water, transportation, all of your infrastructure needs based on a false density consideration. So that, I think, is a very fundamental issue that the staff needs to address in great detail. And if there was a full and complete analysis, I think it would be helpful for the Board of County Commissioners and the Planning Commission to show exactly where the changes were and what the infrastructure changes were as a result of that analysis.
Okay. Is that it for your comments?
Yep. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. We'll see if we can get some clarity on that too. All right. Was there another one on Zoom? Diane, can you hear us?
Hi, I can hear you guys. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having this, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak. My name is Diane Wright. I am a full-time resident on 30A in Blue Mountain, and I'll keep my comments quick. My background is actually, I'm a wetland ecologist, and I just wanted to speak to the value of our wetlands in our, our small community. I think what's been said previously by Barbara Moreno is pretty important, and our wetlands are a critical resource here. We have great hurricanes and flooding, and our wetlands are a buffer for all of us, all of our homes and our communities. And if you start playing with that, we're going to be in big trouble. And once our wetlands are gone, we're in for it. So I just really wanted to speak to the value of this resource that we have that's really special down here. And, I think it's important what you guys are doing, and I support the elimination of this density transfer. I think it's ridiculous. And what D.R. Horton was trying to do, I think, is appalling. They bought this piece of land with so much wetland on it, and then based on that, they're going to cluster, 164 triplexes in this teeny tiny lot. And I think the indirect impacts on wetlands when you do that are phenomenal. All those people and traffic, adjacent to these wetlands, I think needs to be spoken to as well. So I support the new changes that you guys have to the code, and I hope you'll stick to it. And that's all I have to say. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. All right, we'll come back to, we'll go hit the people who haven't spoken yet, so if you want to come up.
Brad Reed, R-E-E-D. Wetlands keep coming up, but this is, it seems to me, an issue over density. This proposed policy, in my opinion, will be detrimental to the wetlands. The developers are going to make their return one way or another. People want to live here, they're going to come, and developers are going to provide these homes in a product that they can afford. And if you take away the incentive to avoid the wetlands, you're going to see more dredge fill permits. Just like Ms. Ward said, bigger lots are going to be, bigger returns on the individual lots. And it seems like people are getting stuck on wetlands. This isn't about wetlands. This is about reducing density. And if you get rid of the one policy that incentivizes to build only in the uplands, you're going to end up with more dredge fill permits. That's all.
Okay, thank you. For anybody who hasn't spoken, we'll give you guys an opportunity. Okay. Is there anybody in the room that wants to speak that hasn't yet? Okay. Is there anybody left on Zoom that hasn't spoken? There's one. All right, let's go to that, and then we'll come. All right, Margaret, can you hear us?
Yes, sure can. I just want to reiterate what Donna and Diane said about the wetlands being so important, not just for floodwater, but for wind damage. They protect our neighborhoods. And, I think one of the primary problems we're having is zoning changes and increased densities allowed through zoning changes. But I just think we need to do whatever, and I'm not sure what language is better, but whatever we can do to protect, because these, if you're filling in wetlands, of course, your neighbors, we're getting more water. So, there's the storm water, there's the wind damage, there's, the flyway. We are a beautiful area. The reason we do have so much green space between 98 and the Bay is because we accept a lot of flood water, that's how it is. So whatever we can do to protect the wetlands, I think is how it should be worded. And that's all I wanted to say.
All right, thank you very much. All right, go to Fred first, because you raised your hand first, and then we'll come back there.
I'd like to talk about something that's not in the comp plan or the land development code. and that is in a wetland situation, the transfer of preservation. And by that, I mean that currently the practice of Walton County planning is to say that if you got property that's zoned conservation residential, let's say, that requires preservation of 60% of the vegetation, right? And if it's, let's say the property is half wetland, what the planning department says, well, you've met your preservation requirement on the wetland portion of the property. So on the upland portion, you can clear cut it. You don't have to preserve anything, which to me, all these wetlands, at least most of them, are not only wetlands, they're also in a flood zone of some kind, low-lying areas, not much gradient. So the last thing you want to do is have a policy that kills trees and vegetation that's going to soak up water. And I've made that point before in testifying at various hearings, and nobody seems to want to pay attention to it. But this is a good time to make it clear. There's no justification. There's nothing in the Land Development Code that allows them to transfer that preservation requirement. That's something that's been made up by the planning department. It's time to get rid of it. It's time to get it clarified. And I would suggest you do that as part of this rewrite. Thank you.
Just to, because you brought it up, and just to make sure that I understand where you're coming from. So if we use the conservation residential category, it has a low density allowance. I think the highest is
2 to 1. Yeah.
And then the lowest is 1 unit per 10 acres. So it has a naturally low density relative to other categories. But the idea behind that, so when it talks about a development percentage, so if we use the 2 to 1, conservation 2 to 1, it allows for that, it's a 40-60 split. So 40% of the property has to contain the development impact. That includes infrastructure and home site, stormwater, all of that. Mm-hmm. And in the conservation residential category specifically, it talks about that it uses the term open space.
Right.
That has to be preserved. Preserved may be a strong word, but for discussion, preserved. And that's the idea behind that, is so that it protects the environmentally sensitive portion of the property, which typically you see a high ratio of wetlands in conservation residential. It's the reason why it has that category, that zoning designation. So the idea of if the developer, if we use the 50% split, half of the lot, half of the parcels is in wetlands, that's the portion we want them to count as towards that percentage, so that the development is outside of that. That's the way the language is currently written, but that's the idea behind that policy, is to protect the wetland portion.
Okay, well, the wetland, you can't touch the wetlands anyway, right? So
that's not, you've made that comment a couple of times, but you can get permits to impact wetlands. That's happens on a lot of development sites. So that it's not completely accurate to say you can't touch them, because you can get permits to impact the wetland, and it's not real hard to do. It can be expensive for sure, and not everybody wants to spend the money to do that. But there is a process that can be permitted. So the idea with our language is to try to de-incentivize that. Don't go get a permit to impact the wetland, but protect that wetland. Leave it in its natural state so that it can do and benefit the community the way that everyone wants it to. So just in regards to that specific category, I just wanted to.
Okay. Let me just rephrase it just a little bit. If you got uplands, let's say we get rid of the transfer capability.
Okay.
You got uplands that could be zoned conservation residential 2 to 1 or low density residential 2 to 1. Which one's better for the environment and for stormwater and for floodwater?
Well, I think it would depend on the property you're dealing with.
On any property, conservation residential with preservation, vegetation is always better.
Okay, so in that scenario, if a zoning category has a preservation requirement or an open space requirement, You want that to only apply, or to apply within the upland portion.
Correct.
And so, as if the wetland is not part of the development side at all?
Correct. That's exactly right.
Okay.
That's what I'm trying to say.
All right.
Maybe I didn't say it very well.
No, that's...
I don't have Melissa here to rephrase it for me.
Yeah. So, all right. So,
okay.
So the wetland shouldn't be included in the development
at all
calculation in any form?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. And then was it Jacqueline? Okay.
Speaking of what, I have 20 acres that right now I can only build 8 single-family houses on. And when you go this 2 to 1, it brings us down to 4, and this was with 2.5 acres. I don't see that as impacting density. Is there any way for people who don't want to, had no plans to have high density on their land, to have some kind of exception for not having to use the 2 to 1 on their acreage?
So with your specific property, do you know what your zoning category is?
Non-agricultural. 2.5 acres per. I'm allowed 2.5 acres.
1 unit per 2.5?
Yes.
Okay, so that's probably conservation residential. Conservation residential 1 to 2.5. That's the, so that of our discussion we were just having.
Mm-hmm.
The conservation residential has 3 density categories. 2 to 1 is the highest density. Then there's 1 to 2.5, and then there's 1 to 10. So you're in that mid range. In your category, you actually have to preserve currently 80% of your, you said 20 acres? You would have to preserve 80% of that in open space. So you would have to limit your development impact to just 20% of.
With this new law?
No, with the current zoning.
Well, I've always been told we could build 1 house per 2.5 acre.
Yeah, that's your density. So then you would have to, without the proposed change, well, the way the current language reads, you would want to transfer that density or cluster the underlying density to the 20% area that you're allowed to build in. Physically, you may not be able to fit all of those homes. So that's where it gets into, one of the examples we showed was only 5 lots, but the overall development site I think was like 14 acres, something like that. So because they were only able to fit, they had a different zoning category, but because of the environmental impacts on that property. So it was an example of a lower density result or project that had a high percentage of wetlands that were or what were even protected through buffers and whatnot. So yours would be similar to that. You may only be able to fit, and I'm just throwing numbers out, half of your density physically on that portion of property. So it would really depend on the way the project was laid out. The proposed change, if it would break it down, there'd be another calculation where if half of your 20 acres was wetlands, then your density would only be within the 10 acres of upland. So your 1 to 2.5 calculation would still apply, but it would only apply to 10 acres. That's what the current code, that's what the proposed change, how it would affect. The discussion that we were just having about whether or not we shouldn't include it at all hasn't happened. There's no language in that arena yet. But if that took place, then your 10-acre tract that's now your 20 acre that's reduced to 10 acres would now be reduced to 2 acres based off of the zoning category. So that's how those reductions would, but that's just within this conversation at this point.
So with the new proposed, how much is it going to decrease my?
So that would cut your density if you have 20 acres. It's going to depend on how much of that acreage is wetlands. So just
let's just say 50%.
If it's 50%, then it cuts your density in half. Yeah. Now, if you have 40% of its wetlands,
like it's so arbitrary, and I don't know who would ever say that they thought one house on 2.5 acres was too much density. It seems like they should make some exceptions for
the current zoning
yes,
density allowances?
Yes, for people who don't plan to sell out to a developer and build a bunch of houses, but they'd like to at least be able to develop what they were able to develop before.
Okay. All right, thank you. Sorry, I'm making notes. All right, is there anybody else in the room that hasn't talked? Do you have anybody else on Zoom? 3 more, all right. Okay, who's up first? Okay. Yeah, Scott?
Yes, additional question. Can you hear me okay? Raise your hand. Okay.
You can't see me.
The question regarding compatibility of land use under the transfer development rights concept, it would be helpful if the staff could provide a memorandum or a summary as to what are the restrictions for determining compatibility with adjacent land uses. If the scenario that Julia was talking about was transferring that density on an upland, and you ended up with an apartment complex, is there anything that would restrict that property from being able to be developed as an apartment complex? And if so, where are those restrictions, and what policies or regulations are in place that mandate consideration for compatibility with the adjacent land use?
Yeah, so Scott, I think part of that answer would depend on what the current zoning designation is of the subject parcel and the zoning of the surrounding parcels. Because some uses are zoning categories are going to allow specific uses. So a particular zoning category may not allow the use of an apartment. So that would depend a little bit on the zoning itself. But I think there's some. Is there guidance, or how does the compatibility analysis work now? Yeah. Yeah, in case you didn't hear that, there is currently a planning director directive, is what it's called, that provided guidance on how to conduct or complete a compatibility analysis. But we'd have to double check this, but that may only apply to a specific zoning category of neighborhood infill. But I want to say that there was some changes, and I'll just apologize for not knowing this, but there was some change to the way we did compatibility analysis. We'd have to follow up with that. I don't do that in my everyday function, so I'm not sure what the protocol looks like.
You could publish that to the group. That would be helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. All right. Margaret?
Hi.
Okay.
It's me again.
It's all you.
I was just referring to the lands that have, let's say that piece of property that had 20 acres. If you have 50% of that is wetland area, those properties, I know when we were looking for property 20 years ago to purchase, properties that had a substantial wetlands on them were less expensive than properties that had upland. And I think the reason for that is they were not going to be developed. Those were going to be kept in a conservation. And again, I go back to the zoning. I think that our zoning ordinance laws have been changed. I think people come up and ask for a rezoning and get it, and that causes problems with density. So that was it. Thank you very much for your time. And thank you for your work on this. I know there's a lot of different opinions and everybody's very emotional about it, and it's hard to do, so thank you.
Yeah, we appreciate that. Hopefully this gives an opportunity for everybody to vet it and then we can go from there. So we appreciate you being involved and helping us do that. One more? All right. Yeah. Okay, fun.
Hello.
All right.
Hi. I was just wondering if we know at what point this information will be presented to the Planning Commission, and also if there are folks that weren't able to make it to this meeting, is there someone in particular they should email to let you know their opinion?
Yeah, so we were gonna hit, one of our slides has the next steps on this. I think we are slated to bring it back in April to the Planning Commission. What's that actual date? Looking it up. Yeah, most of the email comments that we've received so far have been sent to our planning manager, Kristen Schell. Yeah, okay, so, and we also have a planning email that you can use, which is planning@co.walton.fl.us. Either one of those would probably be the best email. And it's April 8th is, that's what our goal is, to bring it back to the Planning Commission.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thanks for your work on this as well. Where could we find the proposed language for this? I think I missed the proposed language somewhere.
Could you pull it up on that and show it? Okay, so if you go to the county website, I'm going to talk through what Aaron's doing. And you go down and you click on the meeting button there.
Okay.
You can go to the meeting. You can click it there, or if you click on the date in the calendar, and then we've got a link to the language right there in the agenda.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Is there anybody else on Zoom? Hand raised. Scott?
Yeah, question, is this going through a comprehensive plan amendment process? And if so, when is that next cycle set for?
It is. Yeah, so it would go to the next step would be the April 8th Planning Commission. From the Planning Commission, they could either, they'll make a vote whether to approve it or deny it. If that's the case, it'll go forward to the county commission. If they decide to kick it back for more workshops, then that could delay that. But then once it goes to the county commission, it has a transmittal hearing, and then it'll go to the state for their input. If it makes it through the state there may be changes in that. There's also a challenge period in there, that somebody could challenge the language depending on what it looks like. So it gets pretty blurry after April 8th. as far as what the dates will look like, we won't really know until we know what the planning commission does with it, and then after it gets to if it gets to the Board of County Commissioners at the next hearing, then we would know more at that point.
So are you going through a standard cycle, or would this be a freestanding application?
I think it's yeah, but I think this would be the only proposed change. Yeah.
All right, so this is still going to be a 4 to 6 month process.
It very well could be, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Anybody else on Zoom? Anybody else here? Quiet ones in the back? All right, well, with that, I guess we appreciate you guys coming out. Appreciate you giving us your input, and you gave us a lot to take back. We took some notes, and we'll if you haven't signed in, please do so on the way out. You can leave us your email address, so if we want to get in touch with you, maybe if we have some questions about your comments or anything, and we'll go from there. So appreciate everybody being here. Oh, okay. Thank you. All right, and this isn't the only, and I don't know if we've off of Zoom or yet or not. This isn't the only opportunity you'll have. This is an additional opportunity that the Planning Commission wanted. So the Planning Commission meeting is a public hearing as well, public meeting, and so you can have an opportunity to talk there as well as going to the County Commission whenever it makes it to that stage. So, but again, we appreciate y'all being out. Go get some dinner, go home. Have a good night.